Do you remember your childhood hometown? The friends you played with in the middle of summer when the only thing better than a cone of ice cream was playing dodgeball in the park? I certainly do, well, some of it anyway. I remember Georgie, a friend of mine that I always hung out with during that time. They called him Book Nerd George. We used to play Super Mario over at their house every weekend and his mom would bring us unlimited pizza. They were well off, I suppose. I remember the abandoned building behind the church and how we always dared each other to go inside only to chicken out at the last second. I also remember the scary stories. Those things always stuck to me. There was always talk in town about a creature that comes out at night to look for wandering children, but we knew it was make-believe. There was also the occasional headline about serial killers a couple of cities from us. That would always keep us inside the house for a couple of days, but as kids, we almost always seemed to forget them after watching a few episodes of cartoon. But there was one thing that always stuck to me. A story about our local priest. I remember my mom telling me a new town priest was recently assigned to our area. He was born into a wealthy family and studied a field in engineering. When they asked why he pursued priesthood, he would just crack a smile. He was in his late 30s and was an eccentric character. Old town people thought he was secretly an atheist, teenagers thought he was cool, but we kids didn't really care about any of that. We cared about the scary stories. Then, one night as my mom was doing her dishes while on the phone with one of her friends, I overheard her saying something I shouldn't have.
Have you ever seen Father John out in the sun?
She asked. No. Apparently, nobody has. He always seems to be in the shade or inside the church and comes out in the open only after the sun sets.
What does he have, a skin condition?
No wonder he's so pale. Of course, my child brain jumped into the immediate conclusion that my local priest was some sort of creature that hated the sun. A gal perhaps. I was hyped about it for days, telling all my friends in the park. Georgie and I went to the bookstore and looked through the horror section with stars in our eyes. Dracula, werewolves, zombies, aliens, the works. That lasted for a couple of days. My excitement slowly turned into fear and dread. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night in sweats and see a figure in the corner of the room, but of course it was only the shadow of a tree. Sometimes when biking alone through the empty neighborhoods at dusk, I would feel something watching me, stalking me from behind. That feeling you get in the back of your neck, that tingling sensation, that feeling that something was creeping on you. You know what I'm talking about. It didn't end there. I stopped going out of the house entirely during the last month of summer vacation. I spent my days locked up in my room or in the living room with the TV blaring as loud as it could. My mom told me years later that I went through her entire VHS collection in just a week. I also only attended church just once since and tried hard not to look at the face of Father John the entire sermon, but I couldn't help it. His pale and bony face was all I could look at the entire time, and his perfect white teeth. My mom let me shake his hand after the mass, and it was freezing cold. It was a hot summer day. But you could also just say that I was just overthinking. Maybe I did. I was only 11 years old, for crying out loud. But what happened during the last week of summer was something that changed my life forever. It was the last weekend of summer when Georgie visited. He rarely came over because of his fear of dogs. We had to. I snuck Georgie into my room before the dogs could get him. I remember Georgie looked different. Tired, I guess. Blank, beady eyes. Like he was asleep inside. I had this very soft bed that my mom got me for Christmas, and the way Georgie sat in my bed, he didn't sink into the soft cushion. Like he was light as a feather. He began telling me about what he had been up to since I was missing in action. He'd read in an old magazine that one of the only ways you could tell if someone was a monster was the lack of reflection. Georgie planned the entire thing. He knew that Father John would take his evening walk from his apartment adjacent to the church towards the park, around the cemetery and back. Georgie told me how he snuck out one of his mom's mirrors and waited for Father John to pass through the park at dusk. I remember Georgie was babbling at this point. I couldn't understand some of the things he was trying to tell me. I was shaking, almost crying. I didn't know what to do or say. Georgie was as still as a statue, his eyes pitch black, skin pale, on his hands the rolled-up horror magazine. Georgie got up from bed and whispered something to me. To this day, I still remember what he told me, word for word. Boy, our priest has a bloody secret. It's real, boy. I ain't seen no Father John in the mirror, he whispered to me before leaving. That was the last time I ever saw him. Life went on. I still didn't go out that much. I got used to being inside, but I biked a few times around the block looking for Georgie. I passed through his house a couple of times and got told off by his mother. Georgie apparently came down with a high fever or something. He was sick. The last week of summer ended, and I never saw a glimpse of Georgie. I went to church again with my mom and saw Father John again. He seemed to be in good spirits, smiling at people and shaking their hands. I didn't shake his hand this time. It was at the beginning of the school week when we heard the news about Georgie. He passed away quietly in the hospital during the night. Complications, they said. I never really got to find OU. I was a kid, and my friend had died. Everyone was devastated, even the ones that called him Book Nerd George, my mother, the people in church, the friends at the park. He was buried shortly the next week. I never came. My mom went, I stayed at my grandma's and cried the entire time. I cried when we got home and until I fell asleep. The next morning, I found George's rolled-up horror magazine under my bed. He must have dropped it before. I scanned through the pages but found it had some missing pieces torn off from it. I didn't really want to go to school that day, but my mother insisted for some reason I don't remember, so I went. I don't really recall much about that day aside from getting home and going back out again with my bike. I hit all the spots, the park, the comic book store, the mall. I didn't want to stay inside the house anymore. It was almost dusk when I headed home. I spent the past hour in the mall playing arcade games by myself and forgot the time. For some reason I decided to take a detour through the church. The cemetery was just behind it. Maybe I just wanted to see where Georgie was buried. I rode my bike through the bike trail and spotted something up ahead. The sun was already beginning to set, but I could clearly see who it was. It was our local priest. He was walking towards the cemetery with something in his hand. I lagged behind, fearing he would notice me. When I was sure he was past the cemetery gates, I came up and hid behind some bushes. I've already stashed my bike a few yards behind me and went on foot. I sat and watched. Father John was dressed in a sweatshirt and jogging pants, and I was under the assumption that he was on his evening walk as he always did. But this wasn't his usual route, and he had a shovel in his hand. He paced around, and I remember he looked in my direction once. I froze in place and, ironically, prayed that he didn't notice. He paced around some more and I watched him get down on his knees and put the palm of his hands on the ground. It was freshly dug dirt. It was a new grave. It was my friend George's. He looked around suspiciously and waited a couple more minutes until the sun completely fell behind the trees. Darkness. He began digging. I still remember what it sounded like. A crunching sound as metal dug through dirt. It was almost completely dark at this point, so don't take my word for it, but I could swear he had the biggest grin on his face. It reminded me of a kid opening presents on Christmas morning. His white grinning teeth almost reached his ears, almost inhuman. He was fast and strong, grunting with each scoop of soil. I completely froze at this point. My 11-year-old brain was trying to understand what was happening. It's not every day you see your local priest digging up your friend's grave. What was the point in all of it? My mind wanted to go home, but my body was stuck to where I was. I may have even pissed myself. I watched him dig through 6 feet of dirt before I heard him hit the wooden coffin with his shovel. I remember him making a maniacal sound. I couldn't see him anymore inside that hole and behind the pile of dirt he had made, but I could imagine him as a creature that completely shed his human form. That sound wasn't coming from the mouth of a man. He began breaking the coffin. It was easy for him. It took about 3 hits. I heard the wood breaking easily. At this point I managed to crawl away. I had enough. Never have I wanted to go home as badly as I did. I didn't even notice the tears flowing from my eyes. What was he going to do with George's body? As I began to turn back, I heard chewing sounds. It reminded me of our dog's feeding time. Sloppy, wild, hungry sounds. I heard bones breaking and meat tearing apart. I imagined this beast or whatever this thing was feasting on book nerd George's corpse like a rotisserie chicken, tearing meat and bones off the body, limb from limb. My body started freezing again, but I forced my legs to run. Before I could get far enough, I heard a wild maniacal sound again one last time. I never looked back. I ran through the thick bushes in the darkness and retrieved my bike. I don't remember much of the journey home, but I remember coming down with a high fever for a couple of days. I never went back to church. That was 13 years ago. I left home after high school and worked odd jobs from city to city. Been in jail for times throughout and never really got into a serious relationship. It may be more than a decade past, and I'm not sure if I dreamt everything or not, but that experience changed me. Home feels very far these days, and those memories farther. I'm doing better now. Got a job working at a publishing house stacking sheets of paper. One of these days I'm going to write my first book. Although sometimes I just want to come back home and dig up George's body behind the local church to see if it's still there.